As the HOA president, I assure you everything is handled. The funds were allocated properly. There's no discrepancy.
The front door swung open without a knock, without a ring, without a single second of hesitation. A woman walked straight into someone else's home like she had every right in the world to be there. Clipboard pressed against her chest, laminated badge swinging from the lapel of her blazer, heels announcing each step across hardwood floors she had never been invited to stand on. She moved through the living room with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before, or at least someone who had convinced herself she had the authority to. She pulled open a closet door, she scribbled notes, she even called someone on her phone, speaking in a voice loud enough to travel down the hallway, reporting that she was inside and that the place was, in her own words, actually quite nice. She had no idea. At the far end of that hallway, in a back office with the door slightly ajar, a man was seated at a desk. He was dressed in full black judicial robes. Reading glasses rested on his forehead. Multiple screens in front of him carried a live, secured federal court session. He was not on a lunch break. He was not between cases. He was actively presiding over a sentencing hearing at that exact moment. She had walked uninvited and unannounced into the home of a sitting federal judge, and he had just heard her open his closet.
To understand how this moment happened, you have to understand who Arthur Calloway was, and more importantly, who he had spent over 20 decades becoming. Arthur had served on the federal bench for 23 years. He had presided over cases that stretched across multiple states, involved hundreds of witnesses, and produced verdicts that reshaped entire industries. He had looked across the courtroom at fraudsters, at career criminals, at people who believed their connections made them untouchable. He had seen audacity in forms most people never encounter in a lifetime. He was not a man who rattled easily. He was not a man who made impulsive decisions, and he was absolutely not a man who wasted energy on conflicts that documentation and patience could resolve far more effectively. When Arthur and Margaret decided to leave city life behind, they were deliberate about it. Margaret, a retired attorney herself, researched neighborhoods for months. They wanted a quiet cul-de-sac, mature trees, a front porch with room for 2 chairs and a slow morning. A community where weekends meant gardening and reading, not confrontation. Maplewood Estates checked every single box on paper. The homes were classic colonial-style properties with clean lines and manicured hedges. The streets curved in gentle arcs through established landscaping. The neighbors waved from driveways. On the Saturday the moving truck pulled away, Arthur stood on the front porch and told Margaret it felt exactly right. What neither of them knew, what no listing, no neighborhood tour, and no amount of due diligence had revealed, was that Maplewood Estates had a shadow government. Her name was Sandra Pritchett. Sandra had appointed herself president of the HOA, treasurer of the HOA, and community standards officer, all simultaneously, all for 6 consecutive years, all with the absolute certainty of someone who had never once been meaningfully challenged. She owned a laminated badge for each title. Neighbors had seen her wearing the president badge while checking her own mailbox. She ran the neighborhood Facebook group with the moderation style of someone who believed public opinion was a resource she personally managed. The Calloways moved in on a warm Saturday in early April. 11 days later, the first envelope arrived.
The letter was typed on HOA letterhead. Sandra had invested in professional stationery, which should have been the first warning, and it cited Community Standard 4.7 subsection B. The Calloway mailbox post was positioned 4 inches farther from the curb than the handbook specified. 4 inches! Arthur took a tape measure outside that same afternoon. He measured the post. He measured the relevant passage in the handbook. He moved the post the required distance. He said nothing, filed no complaint, and returned inside, because he was a reasonable man, and reasonable men do not spend their afternoon energy on 4-inch disputes. The second letter arrived 5 days later. Their garden hose was visible from the street. This constituted a violation of Community Standard 7.2, which apparently governed the visual accessibility of outdoor utility equipment. The third letter arrived 6 days after that. Their welcome mat, a burgundy rectangle placed neatly at the front threshold, was not a color appearing on the HOA-approved aesthetic palette. Sandra had included a printed copy of the approved palette with the letter. Burgundy was not on it. Margaret read that letter twice. She set it on the kitchen table without a word. Arthur picked it up, read it once, walked to his desk and created a new folder on his computer. He labeled it simply, Documentation. He had spent 23 years watching people underestimate the power of a paper trail. He was not about to underestimate it himself. The letters did not slow down, they accelerated. Over the next 2 months, 11 more arrived. The fence boards along the side yard had a gap allegedly 1/4 inch beyond acceptable width. Margaret's window boxes, planted with seasonal flowers she had tended carefully since the day they arrived, were described in formal written language as an eyesore inconsistent with community aesthetic values. A small decorative stone near the front walkway was cited under a 2019 amendment that no other resident appeared to have ever seen or acknowledged. Sandra began adding a physical component to her campaign. Her white Cadillac sedan became a fixture on their street. She would slow to nearly a stop in front of the Callaway home, clipboard in hand, making notes through the windshield, then ease away without so much as a glance toward the house, day after day, sometimes twice in a single afternoon. Then she took it online. In the Maplewood Estates neighborhood Facebook group, which Sandra administered, she posted publicly that the Callaway property was having a negative impact on surrounding home values. She described them as resistant to community cooperation. She referenced the violations as official notices, using that word 3 times in a single paragraph to describe citations that included, among other things, a welcome mat. The post drew comments. The comments drew more comments. Sandra moderated the thread with visible satisfaction. Then, in what she clearly believed was her most authoritative move yet, she filed a formal HOA request for an interior home inspection. An interior inspection request from a homeowners association carried exactly 0 legal weight, and Arthur Callaway knew that better than almost anyone alive. HOAs do not have the authority to enter private residences. They cannot compel inspections. They cannot access interiors without owner consent, a court order, or a documented emergency. These are not gray areas. They are settled, codified, unambiguous points of law. Arthur drafted his response the same evening the notice arrived. He sent it certified mail with return receipt requested. He cited 3 specific state statutes. He explained in clear professional language that no HOA representative would be permitted to enter the home, that consent was explicitly being withheld, and that any attempt to do otherwise would have legal consequences. He signed it with his full, publicly searchable, professionally documented legal name. Sandra did not search it. Thursday arrived. At 2 in the afternoon, Arthur was at his desk in his home office, dressed in full judicial robes, connected via secured video link to an active federal sentencing hearing. The court reporter was on screen. The defendant's attorney was on screen. The proceeding was live and on the record. At 2 minutes past 2, he heard the front door open. Margaret had stepped out briefly. In a small, ordinary, completely human moment of distraction, she had not locked the door behind her. Sandra had interpreted an unlocked door as permission. She moved through the house without rushing. She had the unhurried confidence of someone who had never been stopped before and who had long since stopped expecting anyone to try. She opened the hallway closet, made notes, called someone and gave a live update. She was inside, everything looked fine, the violations were somehow even less excusable given how nice the interior appeared. Arthur requested a brief recess from the court reporter. He stood up from his desk. He walked down the hallway in full judicial robes, glasses still pushed to his forehead, moving with the measured calm of a man who had spent decades walking into rooms where the stakes were very high and the atmosphere was very charged. He stepped into the living room doorway and stopped. Sandra turned around. What happened to her face in that moment was not simple surprise. It was the specific, cascading expression of someone whose entire understanding of a situation collapses in real time. The clipboard dropped several inches in her grip before she caught it. The phone call went quiet. Her posture, which had carried her through that door with such authority, simply left her. Arthur did not raise his voice. He identified himself. He noted with complete composure that she was standing inside his private residence without consent or legal authority. He advised her, in terms any attorney would recognize immediately, to stop speaking and contact legal counsel before taking another action. Sandra laughed, not confidently, reflexively, the way people laugh when they are frightened and have not yet admitted it to themselves. Then she made her final, defining mistake. She asked him if he knew who she was. He asked her, quietly, if she knew who he was. She did not. Within 2 weeks, she had filed a civil harassment claim against a sitting federal judge for standing in his own hallway. Sandra's attorney, a civil litigator named Mitchell Carr, walked into the assigned courtroom, looked at the bench, and recognized Arthur Calloway before he had taken 3 steps through the door. Carr had appeared before Judge Calloway in federal court 3 times. He requested an immediate recess. The conversation that followed in the hallway was later described by a courthouse staff member as extremely direct. The phrase catastrophic error was reportedly used more than once. Sandra moved to withdraw the suit. By then, Arthur's own attorney, a former clerk who was thorough in the way that only people trained by exceptional judges tend to be, had already filed. Unlawful entry, harassment, defamation related to the Facebook posts. Each claim was documented, time-stamped, and supported by the folder Arthur had been quietly building since the very first letter about a 4-inch mailbox post. The HOA's insurance carrier settled in full within 6 weeks. A neighborhood vote removed Sandra from every position she held, president, treasurer, community standards officer, by a count of 31-2. The 2 dissenting votes came from her sister and a neighbor named Gerald, whose reasoning remained a subject of neighborhood speculation for months afterward. The laminated badge was handed over in the community center parking lot. No speech, no ceremony, just a badge, a parking lot, and the particular silence of a chapter that had finally, completely closed. The following spring, Margaret Calloway planted burgundy flowers, the exact shade Sandra had once deemed a violation, along the entire front of the house. Every single bloom was fully, deliberately, magnificently visible from the street. No letters came. Here is what this story is really about, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. Sandra was not a uniquely terrible person. She was ordinary. Ordinary overconfidence, ordinary certainty that the rules were tools she wielded, not boundaries that applied to her. What made her story unusual was not who she was, it was who she decided to push. Most of the people Sandra had pressured over 6 years had simply complied. They moved their mailbox posts, they hid their garden hoses, they chose their peace over their dignity, and that is an entirely understandable choice. But if you are watching this and you have a Sandra in your own life, someone using small authority to make your life smaller, write everything down. Respond in writing. Know exactly what they can and cannot legally do, because people like Sandra depend entirely on the assumption that you have not done your homework. Arthur Calloway had done his homework for 23 years. Sandra never stood a chance. If this story hit close to home, drop a comment below. Have you ever dealt with an HOA or neighbor like this? The community wants to hear it. Subscribe so you never miss a story, because the next one is already waiting.